I'm Richard Siddaway. You should all know who I am from this morning. And it's a question I asked a little while back. Do you actually need CIM? It's an old technology. We've got other stuff. Do we actually still need it? So I thought I'd look at some of the things we do with CIM, have we got alternatives, and where it might still be useful to try and answer the question. Slides will be available on GitHub. So a little bit of background. First off, a lot of confusion from Microsoft between the difference between CIM and WMI. Basically, there isn't any. CIM is the Common Information Model. It was invented by the Distributed Management Task Force. Microsoft picked this up around NT4 days as a out-of-band download, called it WMI, because those days they had to change the name of everything. And then with PowerShell v3, they brought in a new API and decided to call it CIM, just to add to the confusion. So PowerShell v1, we got getWMI object. It used DCOM with all the fun that that brings. Anybody love DCOM? Good. But it was the only remoting tool we had in PowerShell v1. I think I said this morning we had 137 commandlets. And that was the only way, unless you wanted to drop down into .NET and write some really, really horrible stuff to do anything remotely. PowerShell v2, we got the WMI commandlets. v3, we got the CIM commandlets. CIM sessions, which are fantastic. CDXML, which is even more fantastic. What you do with that is take your CIM class, wrap it up in some XML that is horrible to write, but and even worse to read, but is relatively simple. Publish it as a module, and you've got a whole bunch of commandlets. The CIM commandlets and CIM sessions, by default, work over WSMan, unless you're working remotely. Unless you're working on the local box without using the computer name parameter, in which case they use COM. And there are some commandlets that use WMI directly, like get hotfix. Your essential reference for PowerShell and WMI, if you haven't got a copy, please do, because my children still want to eat. CIM has a structure. It's not just a collection of stuff, even though it does seem like it sometimes. There is, in inverted commas, a database. And it's more a heap of stuff than a real database like SQL. There are providers that you'll come across. These take MOF files and create the namespaces and the classes. Namespaces are really just to give you a hierarchy. If you think of them like folders in a file system, you're not far off. Classes are where the action is. They've got methods and properties. Most of the properties are read-only. Common question on the forums, how do I change X using CIM? The common answer is you can't, because it's read-only. An instance is something like a service that you access through win32_service. And then you've got probably one of the most useful but least used aspects of it is you can use events. A lot of the stuff that happens under the hood in Windows is actually is event-driven by CIM classes. If you scroll through the list of classes and all of the namespaces on a wet Sunday afternoon when you've got nothing else to do, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of stuff in there that you'll never find any documentation for. And it's all because it's stuff that Microsoft use under the hood. And they basically don't want you poking around in it, or they couldn't be bothered to write the documentation, or they lost the documentation, or whatever. So let's have a got code withdrawal from this morning, so we'll do a bit more in this one. Okay, so providers. You will get a whole bunch of stuff. And the one that you really want to play with is Win32, or sorry, _Win32 provider. The naming convention in CIM is weird. especially with the double underscore stuff, that's the sort of system level stuff. Most of the classes you'll find there's a CIM underscore something and a Win32 underscore something. The CIM underscore is the default base. The Win32 is the Microsoft version. Often they're the same. Sometimes there's a few tweaks. The only one that I've found that isn't duplicated is CIM underscore file. There isn't a Win32 version of that. And nobody has ever been able to tell me why. My suspicion is that they forgot about it. So the providers do things like here. There's some things here that you should recognize, things like the ping provider or the clock provider. And there's, if we scroll back up a little bit, there's some registry provider stuff. Providers will load up the classes, the events, and all of the other stuff and help generate the instances that you can see. Namespaces, as I said, it's hierarchical. It starts with root, which is as good a name as any. CMV32, I hate that. CMV2 is the default namespace that Microsoft use. So if you just do get sim instance, class name, blah, you're going to hit root/simv2. There is a default directory, just to confuse you. That is not your default directory. Pardon? Yeah, it's really a mess in those terms. And you get a bunch of classes for a particular thing. The easiest way to find it is just to run the getSim class with some kind of wildcard search. You'll notice down at the bottom here, you've got a whole bunch of performance counter stuff. Getting performance counters through WMI works. Just be aware that you can get a class that gives you formatted counter information, or you can have the raw information that you then have to tweak and play around with. Those actually are reasonably well documented. One trick that you can do with the WMI objects the WMI commandlets that you can't with the CIM commandlets is this recurse. Starting with root, you can recurse through all of the namespaces and just list out the classes that match your search criteria. For some reason it gets really slow when it hits this RSOP one, but we'll carry on with that. Come on. Yeah, thank you. If you want to look into more details at a class, use getSim class. You almost at the point with that you don't need the documentation, because you can dig into the properties and it will tell you that it's read-only, what the sim type is, and as long as you can work out what it is from the information you're getting, you're good. So you can avoid the documentation for that. One thing that you may need to be able to find is the key to a class. That's usually on one or possibly two properties. And it's important because if you want to create a CIM instance, you need to know what the key is, because you have to define that when you create the instance. Methods, we can get access to that. So you get the return type. Don't forget that you also get a return code. Return code 0 is good, everything else is a disaster. And good luck finding what it means, because guess what? It's not documented, apart from a few that for some bizarre reason somebody did document. And you can, for individual methods, you can dig down into the parameters, and it tells you what the type is. Most of the types that you need in CIM match, so things like booleans and strings match. Okay, most of the numbers are unsigned integers, so you just need to use the uint type when you're defining them. That's in v5 and v6.0, well, up to 6.1. There is a accelerator coming for the unsigned integers in v6. That's not going to help you in v5 though. And the usual thing, if you want to get information about services, shows you running services, etc. by default. Be careful with what you actually get back, because these are very heavily formatted. There's a ton of format data around the CIM classes, so you will find that you won't get everything back, so you start digging in with the usual select all or format list or whatever. I mentioned events again. Excuse me, a whole bunch of events, and you either want to look at the instance events. So you can see there you've got creation, modification, deletion. So you can fairly easy figure out where they go. Just for fun, when we hit the CIM commandlets, they've changed the terminology, so they're now known as indications rather than events. So you can use these as well, which you wouldn't have found if you were just looking for events. As I say, documentation around this. You've also got some classes for specific events, things like process stop and start, or a volume change, which I'll show you later. Some of those you're going to have to search on what it is that you're looking at, like the process or the service or the volume or whatever. And you register the events to use the PowerShell eventing engine. You lose them when you close the session. You can also get WMI permanent events. Has anybody used them? Good. They, in my opinion, they're more trouble than they're worth. I found them to be quite flaky. They will kick off a scheduled task. They'll kick off a CMD script. They'll kick off a VB script. They don't kick off PowerShell. And I tend to avoid them. There are people who love them, and there was a session, I think it was 2017 at the PowerShell Summit on them that was quite well received. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, it might be worth having a look at. Okay. I tend, as you probably guessed and seen, I use CIM and WMI interchangeably unless I'm referring to the particular commandlets. It's probably bad, but that's just me. Okay. And that was done deliberately because there's a lot of people use WMI and absolutely hate it. Anybody in that boat? Anybody hate WMI? Yay, me too. It gets a bit messy. Part of the problem is that we used to use VB script. Anybody work with WMI through VB script? Yeah, wasn't that fun? Especially output. The documentation, as I said already, is poor to non-existent in places. The Win32 classes are reasonable, not 100% accurate, but reasonable. A lot of the rest of it is hit and miss. And CIM classes change with Windows versions. So if you ever looked at process account on a 2003 box using CIM, you would get the number of cores, not the number of processors. It was a bug that was picked up in later versions. Mentioned that the WMI commandlets use decom. Another change that really, really hurt. In Server 2012 R2, the Windows Update Services classes, you could use them remotely, and they worked a treat. They changed them in 2016, Server 2016. They changed the name, they changed the methods, they changed the parameters, and they didn't work remotely. But they would work through a PowerShell direct session from your Hyper-V host. That's why there's a bit of pain sometimes. Date handling from the WMI commandlets was always a joy. And the other really biggie that caught a lot of people is that the CIM commandlets return inert objects. Even if you're on the local box, you don't get the methods back on the object, so you can't do $x equals Win32, get some instance Win32 service, and then do something with it on the methods. Okay. Not that one. This one. So, because I can't tell the time, just to remind you what the VB script looked like. If you have never done it, you had to echo out all of the output. If you wanted to convert dates into a format that was usable, you had to go through a number of hoops. It worked, and it gave you some decent results. The WMI commandlets, much simpler, but isn't that date lovely? It's year, month, day, hour, minute, second, some fraction of a second, and the last bit is the time zone difference from GMT. PowerShell version 2, I think it was, they introduced this convert date time, which made life much easier. CIM is even easier because it does the work for you. And as I said, if you look at the operating system class, you've got a bunch of methods like reboot and shutdown. But if you actually, no, don't do this to me. Right. If you actually look at the object, the methods have been stripped off, and you've only got the default methods. The way around it is you get the CIM instance and pipe it into invoke CIM method. Avoid WMI method. Number one, the parameters have to be in alphabetical order, not the order in the documentation. It's a .NET thing. And there's actually a bug in it as well, depending on if you've only got a single parameter. And as far as I'm aware, that's not been fixed and is unlikely to be fixed these days. Because if you've used PowerShell v6, you only get the CIM commandlets. You don't get the WMI commandlets. There is something that reckons that or I've seen stuff that reckons that they're going to bring back the WMI commandlets in v6, but as to when that happens and if it happens is anybody's guess. The other thing that came back in v6.1 is the accelerators. If you've seen any code about that, it's square bracket WMI or WMI class or WMI searcher. 99.9% of the time or more, you don't need them. About the only time that I've seen people using them recently is if they're accessing the SCCM database through WMI, and they're creating an instance to do that. I can't think of another time when you would actually need them. You can, the commandlets do the job for you. Okay, so up until PowerShell v3, we were using CIM quite a lot because PowerShell did make it a lot easier. PowerShell v3, as I said, introduced CDXML. And this is the commandlets over objects technology. It really only used with CIM classes. You take the class, wrap it up in some XML. By default, you get a get whatever it is by a standard, and then you can use the methods on the class to generate other commandlets to set something. So if you think of the operating system class that I showed you, it would generate commandlets to shut down, reboot, all of those sorts of things. These came in with PowerShell v3, which was Windows 8, and it led to a huge, huge increase in the number of commandlets. If you worked with PowerShell v2 and then saw v3, it was, wow, we wanted more commandlets. We got more commandlets than we could ever think of. The fact that they are CIM classes and they are new CIM classes in this root standard CIM v2 namespace, and they're all, or nearly all, MSFT underscore something, that means that they're not available down level. So you're not going to get that functionality on Windows 7. I think that's got another 2 or 3 years left to run. The same with the Server 2008 family. So you're not going to get those commandlets on those boxes, unfortunately. But it enables you to manage storage, networking, DNS client, iSCSI, printers, a whole raft of stuff. This is the point that a lot of people said, well, we don't need CIM anymore because we've got all these commandlets. And partially true, maybe. So, and just to give you an idea, if you look through the System32 PowerShell modules, you can see you've got stuff, a whole bunch of these CDXML files. They are effectively just been published as modules, or they're the equivalent of a PSM1 file in that respect. All of these that I've tested, and I will be honest and say that I've not tested all of them, but all of the ones that I know that have been tested work under PowerShell v6. So all of this stuff is available to you straight under v6. I'm not going to show you the content of the files because you'd be running out the door because they're scary. But let's see them in use, and then we can decide whether we actually still need CIM. Right. So we've got getNet adapter. Gives us a nice display, gives us the name of the adapter that where we've renamed it, gives us some information about it, the index number. When I first looked at this, I was annoyed, or more than annoyed, because it uses this interface index, whereas all of the CIM classes in the past, if you look at Win32 underscore network adapter, it uses a device ID, which start at 0 and work up, and has no relationship to the interface index. Joined up thinking, yeah. It shows you the status and the MAC address and the link speed, the sort of things that you want to get. Now, if you try to look at that using the traditional net classes, first off, you get all of these mini port things, which I've never known anybody be interested in any of them. So you've got to get rid of those. And then you've got to pick and choose the information you've got. And yes, I'm deliberately using format table because I just want the display. And all I've got there is the the live adapter because I've filtered on net enabled. If you compare that with what we saw with get net adapter, because it's scrolled up, it's similar, but not exact. Mouse is sticking. Need a new machine. So you have to go through some hoops, which will get you more or less the same thing. So you've got these commandlets. They are easier to use because they are commandlets, but it's not something that you didn't have tools to do before. And for systems that are earlier than Windows 8 Server 2012, it's the only way you're going to get it done. We can skip that. One thing that I've often have to do in the past is start digging through matching IP addresses to adapters. Anybody had that fun? Yeah, isn't it lovely scrolling, opening up? And with each successive version of Windows, it's more levels to get down to the adapter information. Okay, so you can get net IP address. I've deliberately restricted it to the IPv4 family, and you can pick off the IP address and the other information. And yes, the 169.254 is because the Wi-Fi isn't picking up an address. Useful troubleshooting if you want to find out if you want to test for connectivity. Actually, that would make a good pester test, wouldn't it? Test the things, see if any of them come up with 169.254 star. Simple test. Makes life easy. Pester, I can see Pester becoming one of the most used modules, and not just for code testing. If you want to try and do that using the traditional classes, that's about as close as you can get. It gives you both the IP4 and the IP6. You can unravel that. I just couldn't be bothered, to be honest, for this. But it gives you the description rather than the name, because that isn't available in that class. Now, if you want to link the address to the adapter, it's relatively straightforward for the commandlets. Get the adapter for each of them, pick off the name, the status, the MAC address, and then the IP address, you just use the get net IP address with the interface index. Nice and simple. If you don't like the way I create my objects, tough. And that works. If you want to do the same thing with the CIM class, you're going to have to get into associations. CIM associations and network adapter and network adapter configuration are good examples. Partitions, volumes, and disk partitions and volumes are another good one. Basically, Class A has an association with Class B that's built when the WMI database is created. And a specific instance of Class A will be associated with a specific instance of Class B. There are commandlets that will give you what's called a reference. All they do is point to the two endpoints. So it will tell you that you need to look in this instance for that and that instance for that. The association is the actual two endpoints and is much easier to use and much better to use. Is that clear as mud? Okay. just think about it as class A associated with class B, and you can work across the link. So,
same as the WMI when they have the antecedents and things like that?
The question was, is the same as the antecedents? Yes, it is. The reference will show you, I can't remember exactly what they are, but basically it gives you two parameters, two properties. One is a reference to the class A, or the instance of class A. One is a reference to the instance of class B. The really nice thing about the references is that the property names are not constant. So it could be antecedent and something else. I think I did document it in the book, and I think there's 3 or 4 different terminology sets that they use for describing the endpoints. So again, WMI is not joined up thinking. And I think part of it is there's a lot of teams in Microsoft have contributed WMI classes, and there was no overall standards body that controlled it. So that's why you get this mess, which is why I tend to avoid the reference and just go straight to the association.
You probably couldn't even read your own code 6 months later.
I can always read my code 6 months later. Might not understand it, but I can always read it. I've still got some scripts with a .msh extension back from the betas of V1. Oh, the fuss that was kicked off when Monad was renamed to PowerShell was unbelievable, especially when they changed the extension.
That's marketing, isn't it?
Yeah. So what you need to do with this is get the CIM instance for the network adapter, and then for each of them you work through. These are the easy bits. Pick off the name and the status and the MAC address. Associations using the WMI commandlets were painful because you had to write a WQL query. WQL is SQL for WMI. It's a very, very basic subset of SQL. And it's every time you write a filter, like this where I've got net enabled equals true, that is the where clause from a WQL filter. If you actually look under the hood at what's going on, this gets some instance class Win32 network adapter with the filter is changed to select star from Win32 underscore network adapter where net enabled equals true. So the filter is that where clause. There was a very odd bug with the getSim instance going across to PowerShell v2. If you're using getSim instance to access a PowerShell v2 box remotely, the version of WSMan changed between v2 and v3. So it would, if you did it like that, it would fail. But if you sent it as a query, it would work. We never did get that answered as to why, but it caused a lot of hilarity when we demoed it in front of Mr. Snover and the PowerShell team. So with the CIM commandlets, you get a commandlet to actually work with the associations. These are actually worth digging into if you're going to be working with CIM, because there's some very powerful stuff you can pull out with this. So you give it an input object, you tell it which class you want back. Otherwise, you'll get everything. So the operating system, the hardware, the processors, it links back to all sorts of things. So tell it the class you want back, and then all I'm doing is picking off the IP4 via address by expanding the property and taking the the first one I get back, which should be the IP4 address. So it works just as well. Bit more code, well, a lot more coding, a lot more understanding. But if you, for whatever reason, can't get access to those commandlets, there are ways and means around it. How are we doing for time? Okay, we've done that. Let's go back to what's next. And just to add to the fun, after we'd got WMI, and then we got CIM, and then Microsoft came up with OMI, along with the Open Group, I think were originally involved. It's now on GitHub. This is the open management infrastructure. And it's basically a lightweight portable CIM. It's on Linux. It's available for Linux and Windows if you want to put it there. It's used on some network switches. Any network admins? You might want to put your hands over your face for this next bit. Arista switches use it. I think some of the Cisco top-of-rack switches use this. ESX has it installed. His face is a picture. Yes, just wait. It's required if you want to run DSC on Linux. The big drawback with it is that it gives you a CIM server on the Linux box, but it doesn't give you any classes. Unless you want to work with frogs. There's a demo class about frogs. And that's it. So you've got to write your own classes. So not only are we missing the commandlets on Linux, we're also missing the CIM classes. I think IBM started doing something, but I don't know where they've got with it. You also need to install OMI on Linux boxes if you want to use the WSMan remoting tool from the Linux box. You need OMI and you need the PSL OMI provider from GitHub. So let's see what that does for us. What I've got is this is just an Arista switch running as a virtual appliance. You can download it as a VMDK. You can, in this instance, I converted it to Hyper-V using the VM converter tool, which is supposedly been deprecated, but there isn't anything actually to replace it. And then just create a VM. You have to create it as a generation 1 VM, so you can use legacy network adapters. But once you remember to do that, and you get a version that actually all works together, you're good. And you can do things like this. So let's get a credential. Let's set some options. Please don't do this in production. Using SSL, skipping all the checks, and then using no encryption is exceedingly naughty and will get your wrist slapped if you've found doing it in production. But for the sake of this demo, I wasn't going to play with certificates. Thank you very much. And then you create a CIM session. CIM sessions are great. The problem with accessing a machine remotely is that you have to build a connection, run your command, get your stuff back, and then kill the connection. That all takes resources, especially if you want to go back multiple times, which is why we get remoting sessions rather than just using the computer name remoting that you get on a lot of commandlets, which, by the way, they've removed in v6. So that's no longer there. You have to use remoting, the remoting session or invoke command. The other nice thing about CIM sessions is that as long as your remote machine comes back within about 4 minutes, it will survive a reboot. Unlike a WSMan remoting session, it will survive a reboot. The bad thing is that you've got CIM sessions and you've got remoting sessions, which are doing similar things. If you really, really want to be masochistic, look at the WSMan commandlets. They enable you to do all sorts of weird and wonderful things with WMI accessing remote machines. Their syntax is incredibly awful, and it turns out that they were written by an intern, and nobody checked what they were doing. And which is why you won't find them in V6. But if you really, really want to drive yourself batty, try using those. It's a challenge. So we've got a WSMan to our Linux switch. I mentioned that you can do the same to a Linux server or an ESX machine. I've seen a number of blog posts and articles about using OMI against ESX, and there are a set of classes. One tiny issue, and it is an OMI issue, if you try to get, go away, if you, okay. That's what you get for talking and trying to type at the same time. I've more or less put all of the instructions for creating one of these Arista switches in either in this code as comments or in some reference slides at the end of the deck. Right. So if you try to just do a generic search for CIM classes, it bombs. It's a little bit awkward because you have to know the class. So you've got this CIM Ethernet port. They've actually followed the Microsoft model because they've also got an Arista Ethernet port, which gives you exactly the same information. So you can get the class, and you can look at its properties. And there's exactly what you would look for on a Ethernet port. And so you the type, the duplex setting is in there, which I've found causes problems from time to time if you get that wrong. Yeah, and you've got some methods. And you can do the standard queries that you would expect. Microsoft actually took this a step further, and they created this Network Switch Manager module, which is available from WMF5 onwards. And this is actually quite useful. It's designed to be running against OMI, and it has a bunch of stuff, the usual gets, sets, disables, enable, so you can play around with it to your heart's content. You can look at the features. SSH you'd expect to be enabled on a Linux-based system. BGP, VLAN, or usual switching type stuff. And you're working over the CIM session. So again, it's one of these CDXML things. You're pulling back the setup of the box. You can look at the global data, VLANs. And you can look at the ports. You can disable ports, always fun, especially if you're not a network administrator, it drives them up the wall. And the status will change. And you can, of course, pull it back. And you can save the configuration. So this OMI gives you another option. Whether you're going to use it directly or whether you're going to use the commandlets, if you're looking at the network switches. As far as I know, there isn't a set of commandlets for working with OMI on ESX. You have to do that manually. But I don't work with VMware, so it's not something that I played around with a lot. But there are some good articles that I've read through explaining it. So the last thing that I wanted to cover was CIM eventing. This is very powerful, I think underused, and it's basically something happens, so I'm going to do this. It's basically how Windows works under the covers. Something happens, even if it's just you pressing a key, and Windows goes off and does something. As I mentioned, with the CIM commandlets, they changed the name to indications, presumably because it indicates something has happened. There's the generic classes, there's the specific classes. You register the events, and then you use the PowerShell event engine. It's not just for CIM events. You can work with .NET events. You can work with PowerShell engine events. And it's something that, as I say, I think people need to be aware of and possibly need to use more often. If you specify an action in an event, it will create a PowerShell job to do that work for you, which throws a lot of people the first time that they see this. And I mentioned my love of permanent events. So let's have our last bit. And what I'm going to do is use the volume change events to automatically copy to a USB file, or to a USB drive. The very first PowerShell user group meeting we had in 2007, I sat for the best part of an hour sticking USB drives in the machine, copying the PowerShell download, and giving the drive to somebody. I wish that we could have done this. So basically, the script is going to take a folder. This isn't the best of code. I wrote it years ago and just resurrected it for today. Test it exists. Kill off any of the event subscribers if they already exist. Then I'm going to run this query when I plug something in, which will test if there's a new volume. When I pull it out, it tests if there's a volume change. The action for a plugin is to copy the files, remove it, just says that it's done it, and then I'm going to register the thing. So I need that. I should have done this earlier. cd c/mydata/ps. Okay, now if that's all worked, I'll plug that in. Actually, let's just pull that out first. You see it creates the jobs. So if you want to do an automatic copy, that's a good way of doing it. Code will be available. So is CIM still needed? Let's have a vote. Who thinks CIM is still needed? Yeah. Fills the commandlet gaps. Allows you to do some things in V6 that you may not be able to do otherwise. Associated instances are a good thing. It's actually how DSC works under the hood, which I haven't mentioned previously, but without it, you won't have any DSC. OMI, things that I haven't mentioned. Who uses the Windows Admin Center? Yeah, you're using CIM underneath. So understanding how that works is useful. SCCM, and who's played with WMI filters and GPOs? Yay, don't you just love them? Right, any questions? I know I've covered an awful lot of stuff here, but I was trying to give you an overview of stuff that is still relevant in CIM. Happy to talk about it offline or at another time if you want more details on anything. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Why is the documentation so poor?
Why is the documentation so poor? I suspect that it's because, as I said, Microsoft is a whole bunch of different teams, and nobody was driving them to produce documentation, and the fact that a lot of it is actually stuff under the hood.
So they're just trying to not mention it, and no one will do anything with it.
Yes, Max?
Yeah, they did mention that it's going to take a little bit of time.
I don't think some of that stuff will ever be documented.
Really?
Yeah, there's some stuff going back donkey's years that's never been documented. So,
Are the events registered just in the session you're at Windows?
yes, sorry, I didn't mention that. The sessions are, when you register events, they are just in the session that you,
So if you close that window,
they're gone. Yeah. You can use the permanent events, but then you get into how do you get the PowerShell to kick off. Yes, sir?
Do you have to use those events to just kind of lay dormant in the background for a period of time rather than being permanent themselves?
Yeah. Yeah, you leave the session open. They'll sit there doing whatever until you decide that they had in. One, if you really if you
Design it in maybe in a wrapper, so it's kind of hidden.
you could set it up with a scheduled job, a task that ran it in a hidden window.
Yeah.
Check out the process stop and start events. If you want to wind somebody up, set a register event that kills off Outlook when they open it. Any more questions?
So presumably OMI is going to be the standard going forward. Or let me rephrase the question. Is CMI becoming legacy currently on the roadmap?
For Windows, definitely not. Will it take over the world? Unlikely. I would love to see some OMI classes for working with Linux, but I think they're going to have to be community driven. I don't think Microsoft are going to do them, certainly not in the near future. And I think from that, we're probably out of time. And I apologize for being late, but I can't tell the time. And thank you very much.